The time is at hand.
From the land of the rising crackheads in Williamson, West Virginia, you're in dark places. My name is Junebug Fugit, and I'm serious. I'm sick of this cold. We need warm weather. Please send help. It got down to 7 degrees a couple nights ago. That's too much. This week on the show, ghost stories. Lots of ghost stories. And even more ghost stories. It's been a while. I was around 10 years old and living in San Antonio. I got back to the apartment first after school. About 5 minutes after being in the place alone, I saw on the reflection of a mirror an older man in a tuxedo who was in the kitchen. I flipped out and ran to my room and grabbed a bat. I waited for about 10 minutes before coming out. I locked the door when I got home and never heard the door open for someone to leave. I didn't tell anyone about it. Fast forward 6 years. I was watching Ghost Hunters with my family, and my mom asked if I remembered the old man in the tux. Crazy stuff. My dad's story, not mine. In the early 1980s, he was working a summer job at Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. One day, he and his friend, Mark, hiked up to the top of one of the mountains. They set their tent inside the Indian pit, a man-made hole dug out by Native Americans hundreds of years ago. The Indian pits were either used as hunting blinds or spots where young braves came to for their first vision quest. Late in the night, my dad wakes up and he has to use the bathroom. Number 1. He crawled out of the tent, out of the pit, and went walking a respectable distance away from the tent. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his shoulder pull him backward. My dad called out, "Hey Mark, what are you doing?" He turned around, turned on his flashlight, and there's nobody there. He shined the light at his feet and discovered that his next couple of steps would have taken him directly over a steep cliff. He did his business and hurried back to the tent. The next morning, the two friends are waking up, and his buddy says to him, "I know this sounds crazy, but I woke up in the middle of the night, and I swear to you, there was an Indian man standing outside our tent." Whatever really happened that night, my dad is still alive. He met my mom in Yellowstone, and here I am writing this story to you today. I stayed at my grandma's house that my father spent a large amount of time in when he was a kid. My father drove us there in one go and was understandably tired after a 17-hour drive. We all started to lay down, and my father checked in on us before going to bed himself. As he was talking, he stopped himself and told us to cover the large mirror, or you will have nightmares. Now, nightmares from a mirror, of all things, sounded like a little bit of fun to me, but my brothers, who were also sleeping in the same room, asked me to cover it, and I did. I asked my dad about it before he left, and he said ghosts use it as an entryway. A week later, I brought it up to my grandmother, and she scoffed, saying, "Oh, this old house ain't haunted." I agreed, but I told her that the reason I brought it up was because my dad told me to cover a mirror. My grandmother then changed her expression and said, "Oh, the mirror." Apparently, that mirror had came from her grandmother. She worked as a nurse and took in those who were going to die, but could not pay for care on their last days. So she made her home into a hospice. Those who stayed in the room with the mirror saw things. A lovely old lady saw and heard a young lady come into her room and played a harp. She was thankful for the lovely songs, but no person was known, nor harp was owned or heard elsewhere. A young boy found an older boy who played games with him and really knew his games. Lastly, a terrible woman refused to use the bathroom and pooped in a cooking pan and hid it under her bed, as well as argue daily. Saw this, and in her words, the devil that spat fire at her. The police were called, and she tried to accuse the nurse of trying to kill her with the devil. I also got stories from my mother seeing the same young lady who played the harp, without the harp that time, and my grandfather seeing the devil guy. My grandfather described him as a red man with horns, too tall for the room he was in, so he, still standing up straight, bent his neck down to fit in, and stared down at him and simply asked, "Why are you here?" I kept the mirror covered. When I was in the 5th grade once, I forgot to put my school uniform in the laundry basket, so the next day I needed it for school and it was dirty. I went to have breakfast in my pajamas while I was thinking how to tell my mom that I didn't have my uniform clean. When I came back to my room, there was a woman I had never seen before, in her 40s, brown dress, dark hair, ironing my uniform. I blinked and she was gone. I would have assumed I hallucinated the whole thing, but my uniform was there, clean, dried, and ironed, and ready for me to use. And it couldn't have been ironed by anyone else because my parents had breakfast with me and my sister was a baby. From the time I was about 12 to 17 years old, I lived in what I believe was a haunted house. I've never had experiences like I had in that house since moving out. A few specific memories come to mind. Once I was hanging up laundry in my closet. I heard someone whisper my name in my ear, clear as day. I'd never sprinted out of my room so fast. Another time, my sister and I had friends over, and we decided to use a tape recorder to ask questions to the ghosts, like they do on those paranormal shows. We played the tape, not expecting to hear anything, and could hear a very soft voice say, "I'm in a closet." We were sitting near a small closet in the basement. My parents eventually decided to sell the house. We moved into a new place before selling this one. My sister stopped by the house after there had been a couple of showings to turn out the lights in the house. She went to turn the lights off in the basement, which had multiple light switches. One was at the far end of the basement, away from the stairs. She turned off that light and swears she heard heavy footsteps of someone running toward her. She ran out of the house without turning out the rest of the lights and locked the door. That was the last time either of us went back until we were in the neighborhood and the new owners offered to show us the renovations they made. Nothing happened then, but they did ask if we wanted to babysit their kids. We politely declined. This is my mom's story, but she is completely sane and I believe it. Our parents went to South Carolina for a wedding. They stayed at some old plantation bed and breakfast spot. She was sleeping when she woke up all of a sudden. She had her cell phone plugged into the wall, and it was on her nightstand. There was a notification on her phone, so it was blinking. The female ghost was dressed in a full-on, old formal dress, and she was fixated on the cell phone, blinking light, and was walking toward it. My mom said, "It's okay, it's just a phone." The ghost turned and made eye contact with my mom, and then disappeared. I used to sell heating and air conditioner units in Michigan during college. There was this really awesome old dude that called for a new high-efficiency furnace in his historic home in Depot Town, near Ann Arbor. As I'm putting together the quote, we get to talking about the home and its history. He tells me that it was part of an underground railroad and had a tunnel that led down to the train station, only about 500 yards away. To be honest, I was more focused on the sale than all the details he was laying out about the house. But one thing that made my ears perk up was the people that lived with him. He tells me about a few, but the one that stuck out was when he said there was an old lady that was so fascinated with electricity that she would turn random lights on and off at random times. As I was printing out the quote and going over the details and payment options with him, the light behind me turned on. And then the one across the room. Then one in the kitchen. And then the one in the hallway. I just kind of got quiet and sunk a little in the seat. Then the old dude raised his voice and said something like, "Okay, that's enough for today, sweetheart. We can do it again tomorrow." To this day, I don't know if the old dude was just having fun with me or if it was real. Side note, I closed the sale and the reinstall team said there wasn't anything too wonky or out of the norm with his electricity. Years ago, two friends and I were camping in fall in a small tent, staggered with two of our heads on one side and one on the other. It was a silent and still night, with fog developing in the moist PNW woods. What sounds like a muffled voice on a cell phone starts coming out from the center of the tent between our heads. I heard someone keep asking, "Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?" My friend asks, "Are you hearing that?" And all at once we all sit up and start shuffling around in the tent looking for the phone. There is no phone in the tent. I look to my friend on the other side of the tent and ask what they heard. It sounded like someone saying, "Hello, can you hear me?" We all agreed this is what we heard, and that the sound was coming from the other side of the tent. The next morning, we find all of our cell phones sitting in the car still, and there's no cell phone reception at the campground. Still sends shivers up my spine. This one time when I was little, I was laying in my bed with my right ear buried in my pillow. I am suddenly jolted awake by this roar that sounded like it was going directly into my right ear. I woke up startled and confused and began scanning my room for anything, as my mind was almost in full panic mode. When I looked to my right, I saw this little boy standing next to me. He was glowing blue, but that wasn't the first thing I noticed about him actually. He looked sad, and I remember feeling bad for him. After a minute, I tried to lean closer to him and even muttered out a faint, "Hey," but as I did, he disappeared. A few days later, I told this story to my mother, who informed me that the people who owned the house before us had a son who died when he was 5 in a car accident. However, it wasn't near the house. I should also note that our house was renovated since we moved in, and a second floor was added. My current theory is that the boy finally found his way back home and realized that his old home was gone. He came to me because I was the new boy at the house. I used to work at a museum that was once a functional prison. Throughout my 8+ years working there, I had been pushed, slapped, bit, dragged, and punched by unseen entities. I always had problems when I would go to lock up certain buildings at night, because you never knew what you would see coming around the corner. I went into the cell house once to turn the lights off, rounded the doorway to see a full-bodied apparition standing there in an inmate's uniform. A split second later, he vanished into thin air. There was a pretty notorious inmate who was involved in one of the riots, and his spirit would follow me around on the grounds. One night, I was with a paranormal group, and we went into an area that we don't let the public visit because it's in disrepair, and we were screamed at to leave, and something snarled at me. It was not uncommon for me, or one of my co-workers, to have shadow people follow us around, and we would even have some poor visitors chased out of certain buildings, like maximum security, by such entities. I have dozens of stories about that place. The absolute worst place to go in that facility was the tower. I went up there with a group once, and one of my co-workers was physically pinned to the wall by an unseen force. 3 huge men tried to pull them away from the wall and couldn't. That's how strong this thing was. It only let my coworker go when I started yelling at it. We went to leave and go down the stairs, which were pretty steep. I was bringing up the rear when I got a huge shove from behind that almost knocked me off my feet, and a voice screaming at me to go away. I've never been in a yelling match with a spirit before, but I ended up in one that night. I was a 7-year-old kid in Utah. I was staying the night at my grandparents' house on Main Street. I didn't want to sleep, so around midnight I went down into the basement. I took my Matchbox cars and played Night City with my glowing better blocks. I had this little metropolis going when my uncle came down to play with me. Should I mention my great uncle died when I was 2? Well, he did. Anyway, my great uncle and I played Night City for a good hour. I remember it like it was yesterday. He drove the Lincoln because that was his favorite car. Anyway, it got too late. He had to leave, so he wouldn't miss his train. He'd left, and I went to sleep. The next morning, I asked when Uncle was coming back to play again. My grandparents were slightly offended that I brought it up. They hadn't seen him since before I was born, and wanted nothing to do with him. He was the black sheep of the family. I said him and I played cars and showed them the car that he drove in our city. They were uncomfortable with this and chalked it up to my imagination. I never met my uncle. Again, he died when I was 2. Over the years since then, I have learned that he drove both a train for Union Pacific and a Lincoln MK Phi. I don't know. Like I said, I don't believe in ghosts. He didn't say that though. I don't believe in ghosts, but I don't know how 7-year-old me knew about things and a strange relative who died when I was 2 and was never spoken of due to certain family issues. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but I remember playing Night City that night with some guy that said he was my uncle, like it was yesterday. He was super nice, and at the end of the game, simply left out the back door. My dad passed away when I was 8 months old. When I started talking, I would tell everyone that I see Daddy. My mom would even walk in on me, talking to my daddy in the crib. Strange thing is, my mom never taught me the word daddy, since I wouldn't be needing it. To make things weirder, when I was 4 years old, I came downstairs and told my mom that Daddy had come to visit me. I told her that he was coming to get Grandma and take her with him. Not even an hour later, my mom gets a call that my grandma has passed away. I was really young. I would guess 8 to 10 years old, but that's just a ballpark, I guess. I shared a room with my younger brother. Our room was very large, and for some reason, we put our bunk beds right in the middle of the room, with the side of the bed facing the doorway. I had top bunk. Every morning, my mom would come into our room to wake us up for school. It was the worst feeling. This morning, I had already been awake for some time, just laying in bed. It was still dark outside. Depending on the time of year, I don't remember. It had been dark when I remember getting up for school. It might have been normal. So I'm sitting there laying in bed, and the door to my room opens. It didn't take much effort to turn my gaze to the door. I see a woman in some kind of white gown, who I can only assume is my mother, even though I never recall her ever wearing an outfit like that. Standing in the doorway, she takes a step in, closes the door behind her, and slowly starts approaching our beds. She gets so close that I'm no longer able to see her, because of the angle I have being on the top bunk. I assume she's going to start waking up my brother at any moment, so I do that kid thing where I shut my eyes and pretend to be asleep. I wait and wait and wait, and I finally open my eyes. The door is still closed. I'm super confused at this point, so I lean over the railing to see what she's up to, and there was no one there. I freak out and cover my head with all my blankets, and I laid there for what felt like quite a bit until I fell asleep. I don't believe in ghosts. I'm sure there's a completely rational explanation for this. Maybe it was my mom, and I just didn't hear her open and close the door again. Maybe there was no one there at all, and I imagined the whole thing. I don't know. It's not a super interesting ghost story, but it's all I got. It's the only weird story I have from my childhood that I can't really explain today. Here is one of my experiences that has stuck with me since I was a kid. I grew up in a house that had this creepy Indian bust of a head and shoulders, and it looked as stereotypical as you can imagine, but something was sinister about it. So for years my bedroom was just outside by this, and I swear that it watched me all the time. It wasn't a trick of the light, it wasn't my imagination, and it was real. One night I saw it looking at me. I was coming in from the movies, and my parents were asleep. I saw this thing staring at me. Its cold bronze looking not so much at me, but right into my very soul. It blinked, and its mouth moved. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. All I could do was stare back at this hideous statue looking at me till my body allowed me to move. I've never felt such malice and evil intent radiate off anything in my entire life. Some years later, my parents died and my house was sold off, and I never found out what happened to that bust. But I rest a little easier knowing that it was hopefully destroyed and rotting in some landfill. This happened to me when I was 9 in 2010. My friend in the neighborhood found a Ouija board in his brother's stuff while he was away at college. He told me what it was and asked me if I wanted to play it with him. Trying to impress him, I said yes, and we went into his room and tried it out. Nothing happened, and we were left disappointed. Later that week, he called me and told me that he looked up how to use the board properly and wanted to give it another go. I agreed, as I was more confident that nothing would happen. So we grabbed a bunch of scented candles and we placed them around the board and did this whole seance stuff. We asked the board if anyone was there, and of course it said yes. We thought the other was messing around, but we agreed to take it seriously because I didn't really care if it was a stupid joke. We asked the ghost what his name was, and it spelled out Owen. My friend asked it if it was a person, and it said no. We asked what it was, and it spelled out demon. I then asked, prove it. You know that call in the intro to Finding Bigfoot? Well, that's the closest thing to what we heard from the garage. Keep in mind, it was only us in the house. It scared us to death and we ran out of the house. We checked the garage and there was nothing there. Anyway, a few weeks go by and he tells me how he is having paranormal experiences. He feels like he's being watched whenever he's downstairs in the kitchen and in the living room. He feels someone sitting on the end of the bed every night. Every time he walks past the garage, he feels someone grab his wrist and pull it toward the garage. Whenever I went over, I always got the feeling that someone was looking at me from the ceiling. It was definitely unnatural. And then came the scariest part of all. We were all playing Army in his room while no one else was home, and we began to hear heavy footsteps downstairs. Except whatever was making it had hooves. It sounded like a full-grown horse was walking around downstairs. Then we heard someone begin to laugh and cough at the same time. My friend ran over and slammed the door and shut it, and we hid. He hid under his bed while I hid in his closet. Then it sounded like someone began scratching at his door with one big claw, like the ones raptors had on their big toe. He started crying, and I was on the verge of tears. My friend yelled, "Leave us alone, Owen. You're scaring us." He began to stop, and then we heard it run down the stairs. My friend got up and threw me out of the closet and grabbed the Ouija board that was in there with me. He ran down the stairs, ripped the screen door off his gas fireplace, threw the thing in there, put the screen back on, and went to turn it on. And when he was about to turn it on, we heard a loud moan from the basement, which was right behind my friend. He flicked the fireplace on and the board began to burn. That was the end of that, and we played outside since he was too scared to go back inside the house until his parents got home. His parents came home and saw that he had burned his brother's Ouija board. They grounded him and threw the burnt board away. That was the end of the paranormal experiences in my friend's house, and that's why I will never take part in one of these games again. My family moved into a somewhat older house on a lot of land when I was 7. We had the most wonderful Akita at the time, a known breed for protecting his family. My dad traveled a lot, so my mom would often be at home just with us 3 kids and the dog. One day we got home from wherever, and Pluto is at the top of the stairs growling, refuses to go down there. My mom naturally feared someone had broken in, so she made me, my older brother, and my little sister go sit in the car with 10-year-old brother in the driver's seat, telling us if she wasn't back in 10 minutes to leave and find somewhere to call the police. This was before cell phones. She ventured back into the house with a knife. Came back out a few minutes later and hadn't found anything. So we went on with our lives. Many, many years later, once I had reached adulthood, my parents revealed to us that someone had previously hung himself in the unfinished portion of the basement, where the laundry room was. My poor brother's room was in that basement. When we lived in that house is when he first began to have issues. He's now deceased after many years of drug addiction. I'm fairly convinced that the house was haunted. When I was 13, in front of my house in Queens, practicing little BMX tricks on my bike, it was about 11 p.m. when I decided to call it a night, but before I did, I wanted to ride my bike along the waterfront in my neighborhood. When I completed the trail, I saw a woman wearing a white gown standing in front of a tree. I stopped my bike because I saw that she had no face. I thought that it was either a mannequin or I wasn't close enough to make out her features, so I shouted, "Hey!" She didn't respond. I rode my bike toward her until I was about 10 feet away, very close, and still no face. Then her head turned toward my direction. I jetted and went home and didn't bring it up anymore for years. 10 years later, my childhood friend saw that same woman with no face. 1 year after that, our mutual friend shot himself in the head a few feet from that very spot. I was 9 to 11 years old. My family lived in a 3-bedroom duplex. I had my own room across from my mother's room down a short hallway. My older brother's room was on the opposite side of the house. For the full 3 or 4 years that we lived there, I couldn't sleep facing my wall. Anytime I fell asleep or attempted to while facing the wall, I would feel someone smack me in the back of the head with their hand. At first I thought it was my older brother being a jerk until it happened while my very loud squeaky door was shut. It also happened for 6+ months when he was in juvie. My mother does not move quickly or quietly, and it even happened while I had a friend stay the night, but only to me, and only when I tried to sleep facing the wall. So one night, my door was left open when I went to bed. I was fast asleep on my back when I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and had a feeling that someone was standing above me. I looked up to see a long, soft, blue light suspended 6 to 12 inches above the floor in the center of the straight hallway between my mom's room and mine. I was upside down, so after about a minute of staring at this soft blue light, I turned over. After a few minutes, I noticed that there's a slim, middle-aged man floating there, covered in blue light. He's making eye contact with me, and his face is expressionless. He's just staring down at me. I had never seen him before, but it didn't scare me for some reason. About 10 uninterrupted minutes of just staring at each other. Somehow, while looking at him, I fell back asleep. I never saw that man again. However, until the day I moved out, I could not sleep facing the wall, or I would be woken up with a quick smack to the back of the head in the middle of the night. No one believed me, of course. We believe you. I was 5 at the time, just moved to Florida from New Jersey, lived in the back of an apartment complex, and on the 3rd floor. Only my mother and I. She told me recently that every single night she'd hear noises of knocking and banging and such around the apartment. The kicker of it all, that proved it, I was in my room with a vaulted ceiling and had stuffed animals on the shelves way higher than I could possibly reach. I was playing in there with some toys while my mother was making dinner, and the door was wide open. Out of nowhere, the door slammed shut hard. Of course, my mother runs to my room to check on me. Apparently, I was laying in my bed, and all the stuffed animals were in a pile in the center of the room. We took a week vacation after that. Another time of proof, my mother went for some water or something in the middle of the night and saw me sleepwalking around the house and stated that I looked like I was chasing something around the house. She called out my name, and apparently I answered in a deep male voice. She then ran out of the house and didn't return till morning. Still get chills thinking about this stuff. Okay, so I was about 9 years old when I went down to the graveyard to visit my grandpa, as I often did when I was younger. My parents felt that it was safe for me to walk alone since I had my Hello Kitty phone with me, and the graveyard wasn't that far away from my house and my grandma's house. Plus, some of my classmates lived close by too. So I went down, I talked with my grandpa for a bit, and I washed his grave to make sure it was clean, because 9-year-old me wanted it to look nice. After about 20 minutes, I decided to go home. As I was walking, I suddenly stopped and looked over at a tree. My grandma had told me that it was there where her best friend was buried. There wasn't a gravestone there, but over time, a tree had grown on her. I don't know what that meant to my 9-year-old brain, but I decided to talk to her. like I did with my grandpa. "Hello, how are you?" was all I asked, not expecting a response, but then it appeared. It goes to an old lady in her 50s. I assumed that she was my grandma's best friend. I don't remember exactly what she said, but I think she said she was doing good. I stayed an extra 20 minutes and talked to her. I really can't remember what, but possibly we talked about my grandma. The only reason why I left was because my mom called me. I said my goodbyes to her as she disappeared. My parents ran pubs until I was about 16, and we lived in them, meaning we didn't live in a house till I was about 16 or 17. The last pub we had was haunted. Here are just a few incidents. We had things go missing for hours and then turn up in previously searched places. Easy to say that that's BS, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have what's called a Welsh dresser. It's freestanding cupboards with attached shelving. Shelving sits above the cupboards at the back, and the cupboard is about 40 centimeters, just shy of 14 inches, deep. I had gifts from when I was christened on the shelves, and they would fly off, not touch the top of the cupboard, and hit the floor about a foot from the front of the thing. Our internal calling system went off when the pub was shut up for the night, and we were all upstairs. The alarm was on, but did not activate. Answered to hear the phone ringing, to hear the phone being physically dropped. Told my dad, and we both went down to find the phone on the floor and the fire exit open. My brother spent 30 minutes talking to a nice man in a brown coat when we first moved in. The pub was shut and locked. The tips of our kitchen knives would all be curled over. I mean, seriously curled. As tight as you could roll up a piece of paper from one corner. I'm going to preface this accounting of the weird ghostly things that have happened in my house so far with a request. Please don't try to warn me of dangers or give me any suggestions of how to get rid of my ghost. I don't really believe in this kind of thing. I'd love to believe it, but I don't. If my ghost is real, I intend to keep it. It's a little contact to the world I'd love to believe is real. If things get really bad, I may seek advice, but so far it's just a few stories that I thought you might get a kick out of. So here we go. I moved in to an old, spacey apartment 6 years ago. I'm living there with my girlfriend and my two sons, aged 7 and 1, who share a room. So this one night I'm tucking the oldest in, and he decides he needs to go to the bathroom, as boys trying to postpone bedtime are wont to do. So I hide under his covers to mess with him. I hear him walk into the room. He sits at the foot of his bed. I can feel the pressure on the mattress. He says nothing, asks nothing about why I'm all covered up. Weird. Well, I go, boo, and he isn't there. He comes back from the bathroom 2 minutes later, but I'm too weirded out to boo him again. A few days later, I tell this story to my wife, and she tells me that she also has had weird experiences in the bedroom. The baby was already asleep, and she was negotiating sleep with the older son. Suddenly she hears footsteps and sees a shadow of the baby running away to the living room. She gets up to follow him, and then notices that the baby is still in bed, sound asleep. About 2 months later, one of those nights when the baby wins and gets to stay in our room, around 4 a.m., the 7-year-old comes into our room. We ask him what's wrong. He says the baby, who was sleeping soundly all night, has been crying all night, and he can't sleep. We tell him to sleep in our room and say nothing about the baby being in the room. And the final story, my girlfriend lost her mother a long time ago. Nevertheless, she is still very attached to her, carries a picture of her everywhere. On Dia de los Muertos, she decided to put a little altar of her mother next to our living room. She placed a picture of her, lit a candle, and offered an apple. Now, we are not Mexican, so she did what she saw in movies. But there's a detail that she didn't know, and we were told about it later. Mexicans lit special little candles that smoke, but make no flames for this occasion. Smoke guides the spirits of the loved ones, but the fire may attract unwanted attention. The whole altar flew from its place, one thing at a time. First the apple, then the pitcher, and then the candle, like something was throwing them. A second or two between throws. So it's not that something lost balance and everything fell. My son later ate the apple, so I know if he's ever in a horror film, he's the first one to die. Hey, you know what? We are woefully out of time. That's all the stories for this week. We'll see you again next week. Thanks for listening. God bless.